Hello friends, my name is Ajay and welcome to the fourth video in the Introduction to Angular series. In this video, I'm going to show you how to work with HTML templates to connect your component's TypeScript code with the component's HTML code. So without further ado, let's get started. Alright, so this is the website that we were working on in the previous video. We added two new pages to our site, one for our home page and one for our about page. For the sake of this video, I'm just going to be working inside of the home page. So remember, as we talked about before, all of our pages are essentially declared in these components. And our components have three pieces to them, or three components to them. First, you have the CSS file, which defines the styling of the web page. You then have your HTML, which is for the structure of your web page. And then finally, you have the TypeScript file for the actual functionality of the web page. And so today we're going to be taking a look at our HTML page. And I'm going to open up our HTML document inside of our home directory. So this is our home component. And you can see here that the text on the page just says, this is the home page. And I can prove this by running ngserve open to open the site in the browser. So we're going to open this up. And you can see now that we have our nav bar, which comes from our app component. And then we have the text here, this is the home page. So now when we're working with HTML, just like in any other website, we can add anything to this. So for example, we can add links, we can add images, we can add more text. So for an example here, I'm going to create a new link. So let's just say that this is an A tag and this says Apple's homepage. Right, so this goes to Apple's homepage, and we can use this href equals and then provide a URL. So this would be like https://apple.com. And if I save and go back to my browser, which is Safari here, you will see that Apple's homepage now shows up on my homepage right here, and I can press it and it opens up Apple's website. Now, the question is that we can add a bunch of text. So I can say, for example, hello world right here. So hello world. We can say something like the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, right? And if I go back to my page, you can see that this text appears here. But what if I'm trying to generate this text inside of my actual TypeScript code? So this is my TypeScript class, and let's say that I have a field on this class that just says title. And my title, I can set this to any string. So let's say that I set this to a beautiful homepage. Let's say that is my title. Now, how would I access the data inside of this field, inside of this variable, from my HTML template, right? Because, if I go back to my page here, this is plain text. I've just been editing this HTML, but how do I actually establish this connection between my TypeScript and HTML file and load data from my TypeScript file in my HTML file? And so the first thing that I'm going to show you is something called string interpolation. So, spelled out, this is string interpolation. And the idea is that we can pass in strings from our TypeScript file in our HTML template. So you'll hear this word also kind of pop around, which is HTML template. That is essentially just your HTML file. So HTML template is synonymous with the HTML file. The reason why it's called templates in Angular is because you can see here we have this template URL, because a template gives you kind of the structure, right? Like if you think of a template for an email, you may have you may have a title right here, and then maybe you have like CC, and then maybe you have your message or something. So let's just say message. This is a template, but then other things can actually be filled inside of it. So we can have a custom title, a custom CC, and a custom message. And so the idea behind a template is that we are defining the structure of our web page, but some of the actual content can be generated through the through the TypeScript file, and then put inside of the HTML file. So that's the reason why we use the word template here, and you can kind of use this analogy to bridge the gap. Now, if we go back to the HTML, how do we do this? Well, let's say that I create a header. So I'm going to use the h1 tag. So this will be h1. And I can put anything in here. So let's just say for this example, I put in a meaningful title, like so. And when I jump over to my to my website, you can see a meaningful title is printed out. But we want the value of this h1, we want the text here to, instead of being a meaningful title, we want it to be the value that we have stored in this title field of our home component. So what I can do is I can add 2 opening and 2 closing curly braces, like so. And what this allows us to do is now we can put in any variable in here, any function, and its value will then be placed into the template, and its value will actually show up on our web page. So I can just type in title here, which is the name of the variable from the home component. And now if I press save and I jump over to my website, you can see a beautiful home page is printed or is shown on our screen, which is great. So this allows us to use variables from our home component inside of the TypeScript file into the HTML file. Now, another cool thing is I can maybe say generate title, and this is a function inside of TypeScript, and I can maybe say return hello, like so. And the return type of my function is a string. And so what I can do now is I can also replace title with generate title, like so. And you'll see also that this works. And the text that shows up on my web page in this place is now hello. So you can see that we don't just have to put in variables here. We can also put in functions or methods that return a string, and it will automatically show up on our site, which is really, really cool. And so this is kind of the basis for connecting this TypeScript file of our component to our HTML template so that we can plug in data into our web page. Now, this is one way that we can plug in data to our template, but what about this href, for example? Right? So let's say that we have some custom logic to generate a link for my link here. And this is remember this is an A tag, so this is a link element, and we have this property href, and then we pass in a normal string. Well, how can we, just like how here, we put in real TypeScript code into our template, and this generated a value to put on our web page, how can I put in TypeScript code here to generate a value to be stored in my href property? Well, we can do this using something called property binding. The idea is that for any of these HTML elements, we have things like href, which are called properties, right? So these are properties. And when we have property binding, we can essentially bind the property of our HTML element with some other value in our TypeScript file. So let's erase this here and go to our component. And let's say I were to create a new variable that just says maybe URL. And let's just put this to something else, like maybe Microsoft.com, for example. This is my URL. How do I put the value of URL in this href? Well, I can just type in URL here, but the problem is that this is going to be viewed as a string. It's not going to actually replace with the value. So what we can do is around our property, we can add brackets. And what you'll notice now is when I highlight over, or when I kind of move my cursor over a URL, you can see how it says homecomponent.url because it's referring to the URL field of my home component class. And I can save this, and to prove that this works, I'll go back to the site, and now I can press on this link, and you can see that it brings me to Microsoft's website right here. So this is really cool because a lot of times we have different properties in our elements, and we want to have some sort of custom logic to generate those properties. And using property binding, we can connect the values that we generate in the TypeScript file into our elements over here. Another example may be with a button. So I'm going to add a button, and I can say, hello, this is a button, I guess. That's probably more descriptive text. And you can see now that there's a button here. And there's a property on buttons called disabled, right? And disabled, this takes in, again, because we use this property binding syntax here where we have two brackets on either side. What goes inside of these quotes is TypeScript code. So I could just type in true here. So I could type in true, and this is not going to just be, this is not just going to be the letters like a string that says true. This is going to be the Boolean value. Because remember, this here is going to be our property binding, and the TypeScript code goes inside the quotes. So now if I jump back here, you can see that the button is properly disabled. It's kind of grayed out, and it no longer has a clicking animation. So that is the basics of property binding. So we talked about string interpolation, which is this example right here. And I guess I'll add a comment so that it's a little bit more clear. So this is string interpolation, and this is an example of property binding. Now, the last thing you may have seen is, well, okay, we're inputting data into this element. So we've inputted a URL into my A tag, and I've inputted this value of disabled to my button. But what about like actions? Like, let's say I click this button. How can I have this button's actions actually run some code? And so this is going to be our third item that we're going to talk about today, which is going to be event binding. And so what event binding does is it binds an event. So in our case, we're going to use the click event on our button. So whenever the button is clicked, right, that's an event that's going to be bound to some code in our TypeScript file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my TypeScript file, and let me click on, let's just say button pressed. This is the name of my function. It doesn't actually do anything, or it doesn't return anything, but maybe we can just have it console log. So button pressed, like so. How do I get my button to, when pressing this button, run this particular function? Well, we can use the event binding syntax. So with property binding, we use brackets, but with event binding, we use parentheses. So I'm going to remove disabled equals true, and you'll see that when I type in parentheses, it gives me a bunch of events. Right, so I have like animation end, I have drag, if we're like dragging our element around the screen. We have things like mouse over, so that's, you know, if we're hovering over it with our mouse. But there's a nice one that's just called click. So whenever we click the button, it's going to call the code inside of here. And remember, just like with property binding, what goes inside of my parentheses is going to be TypeScript code. Right, so this URL is a TypeScript code, it's a TypeScript variable, and here we can have a TypeScript function call. So let's do that. I can now type here button pressed, like so, because that is the name of my function, and you can see there's no syntax error. This, if I highlight over it, you can see it says it's a method home component dot button pressed. Right, that's corresponding with this method right here. And now, if I go back to my website and I click on Inspect Element and the console, so you can see what prints out, whenever I press the button, you can see that it's now printing out button pressed, right? So every time I press it, you can see that it's printed 14 times. We have button pressed being logged to our console. So this is a very basic example of event binding. However, with property and event binding together, we now have the ability for our TypeScript code to send data to our HTML. So this is through things such as string interpolation and property binding. But we also have the reverse, where our HTML, if there's an event that happens in our HTML element, in any of them, like our button, it can go and now call TypeScript code. So that is how we've created this connection between our TypeScript and our HTML. And remember, in our component.ts file, we have this template URL right here, and the IDE is smart enough to know that this particular, whenever I'm in my home component, the home component is being, so these things are being syntax highlighted. Well, at least this is being syntax highlighted, and there's also autocomplete in and these things because we have this link right over here, right? We have this template URL, which binds the HTML and the TypeScript files together like so. So this is pretty cool. Now, there's a few other features that I want to show inside of our HTML templates, and this has to do with reacting to certain types of elements and certain types of values from our TypeScript file. So let's say that I have a Boolean. I'm just going to call this is true. I know this is a very probably a very bad name for a variable. We'll just keep it at that, and we'll just assign its value to true. What if I want to display items on my web page if a certain value is true or if a certain condition is true, and then if that's not true, display something else? So this would be equivalent to an if-else statement in our normal programming languages. Well, we can do that here too. So I will show you an if-else. So to create an if statement, we can use the at symbol and then type in if, and then we have parentheses. And inside of this parentheses, we can put a condition. So I can say is true here because that is the name of a variable. And I can, just for completeness, I will say equals true with our triple equals because that is customary in TypeScript. And now let's say I say a p tag, the variable is true. Right? Now, if I jump back to my website, you will see the variable is true is displayed on my page. If I were to change this condition, though, to say equals false, you'll see now it no longer displays. So this is really cool because now we can react to values in our TypeScript file and choose whether or not to show components. We can also, right after we put space at else, we can now have an else block. So I can say the variable is false, and I can change my condition back to true. And you'll see that now it shows the variable is true because it's true. And then if I were to change its value here to false, you'll see that it now says the variable is false. So that is how to do if and else statements inside of HTML templates. And the final thing that I'll show is going to be a very common one, which is the for loop. So let's say that I create a list in my component, and let's just call this Pokemon. So Pokemon equals, and now we have different things that we can type in here. So let's add some in. So we have Pokemon like Pikachu, we have Lucario, we have Tangela, etc. These are 3. What if I want to display these? I want to display a new paragraph for each of my Pokemon here. Well, we can use the @for syntax. And now this is a little bit weird. So, in a for loop, we may have like let variable of something. Here it's more shorthand. So we can just say like Pokemon. Well, I'll actually use, because our variable is named Pokemon, because that's plural, I'll just say for p of Pokemon, like so. And now the last thing that this for loop needs is something called a track statement. So I can just say like track p and open close parentheses. Now, what does this track actually mean? Well, what happens is in our for loop, in order to make the site automatically add all of our elements in, and also to better refresh elements, because Angular is doing all this work in the background. So if our list of objects changes, it needs to be able to remove and delete elements from our web page. And to make it easier, Angular uses a track variable where the value of this track variable is going to essentially be attached to the element that is printed out here, so that when it's working behind the scenes to either add or remove elements, it has a unique identifier to identify each of those elements. So it's really for Angular and behind the scenes. So ideally, the value you put in here for track should be something that is unique. So if my list had duplicates in it, we probably wouldn't want to use that for track, and maybe we'd want to do some other variable. If you're using objects, like Pokemon objects, maybe they have like an ID attached to them, some numerical ID, and that might be a better variable to put in here for track. But that's just a requirement for Angular that we include this track syntax. So I can put p now, and remember, this is a variable, right? P is a string, and we have p of Pokemon, this is a for loop, and P is the variable that represents every item in my list. So I can use my string interpolation syntax to drop in my variable P, because this is a string variable here, and I want to display it. If I press save, you will now see that all 3 elements are printed on my site. So I'll add a comment here that just says for loop. Now the last thing I want to show, which is really cool, is there is actually syntax that allows us to provide some sort of a value if there is nothing in my list, right? Because typically, let's say that my list was empty. So let's say my Pokemon list, I just delete everything in it, and I go back and this is empty. What if I want custom text saying, hey, your list is empty? Well, you may think that we can just do an if statement like, add if, and then maybe Pokemon.length, right, equals 0. And then I say my list is empty. And you'll see that that works, right? That is just a normal if statement. We're checking to see if there's 0 elements in the list. And when that's true, we display this text. But as a replacement to this, Angular has something really nice that's called @empty. And so what @empty does is it just runs the code that's in here whenever my list is empty. So if I were to move my paragraph up here to my empty block and I delete this and I save, you'll see now the text still shows up. So this is kind of shorthand. It's really nice because a lot of times, let's say you have a to-do list and you have no items in your to-do list. Instead of just displaying an empty page, maybe you'd want to have some text that says, hey, your list is empty, congratulations, or press the plus button to add your first item to the list, etc. So this is very nice syntax because it just makes everything a little bit more simpler, and you don't have to worry about writing a long if statement to determine the length of a list. All right, everyone, that is all for this video, and this kind of shows you the power of the HTML template in Angular and how to connect the HTML template with the TypeScript code within a component. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you all in the next one.